The voiceover cut through the early morning airport hum like a warning no one saw coming. The system doesn't fail all at once. It fails the moment the wrong person is judged by the wrong eyes. At Gate B17 of Westbridge International Airport, the atmosphere was routine, almost mechanical, passengers shifting in slow lines, rolling suitcases echoing across polished floors, overhead announcements blending into background noise like white static. That was when Darius Coleman stepped into the boarding area. He wore a simple dark jacket, a plain white shirt, and jeans that looked more like he was heading to a business meeting in a small town than boarding a premium economy flight to New York. No entourage, no visible luxury, no signals that screamed importance. Just calm, controlled, observant. At the counter stood Rebecca Mills, a gate agent in her late 30s with a sharp posture and an even sharper tone, trained to keep order, but today her patience was thin for reasons no one could see. She scanned his ticket once, then again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if repetition could change what was already confirmed in the system. "Sir," she said flatly, tapping the screen, "this line is for verified premium economy upgrades only. You might want to double-check your section." Darius didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at the boarding pass in her hand, then at the screen behind her that still displayed his valid seat assignment. Around them, passengers slowed their movement, subtle attention beginning to gather like static electricity before a storm. A young man nearby, Jason Miller, pulled out his phone but hesitated, unsure if what he was seeing was worth recording or just a misunderstanding. Rebecca's voice tightened. "I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify this. We've had issues today with mismatched bookings." Darius finally spoke, his tone steady, almost quiet, but firm enough to settle the air around him. "You already verified it when I checked in. That should have ended it, but it didn't." Rebecca signaled toward the side of the gate, a practiced motion that suggested procedure, not personal judgment, yet something about the way she avoided his eyes suggested otherwise. "Just cooperate, sir. We don't want to delay other passengers." The phrase landed heavier than intended. A few heads turned. Whispering began, soft but present. Darius stepped slightly aside, not in defeat, but in observation, as if he was watching a system reveal itself in real time. He reached into his pocket, not for confrontation, but for confirmation, and placed a call without raising his voice. "Nia," he said calmly, "log this interaction. Timestamp everything." On the other end, his executive assistant responded instantly, no questions asked, only acknowledgement. "Already recording, sir." Rebecca noticed the call and frowned. "Sir, if this is some kind of complaint," she began, but stopped when Darius lifted his gaze toward her, not angry, not loud, just measured. "It's not a complaint," he said. "It's documentation." The word lingered in the air longer than expected. Jason Miller, now definitely recording, shifted closer, whispering under his breath, "Something's off about this." Behind the counter, another agent leaned in toward Rebecca, murmuring about system discrepancies, about double-checking manifests, about policy. The energy at the gate subtly changed, no longer routine, but uncertain. Still, Rebecca held her ground, tightening her grip on authority as if volume could reinforce certainty. "Until this is cleared, you will need to wait off to the side," she said, her voice now less procedural and more defensive. Darius didn't argue. He simply stepped back one more time, placing himself just outside the main flow of boarding traffic. But his stillness didn't match the situation. It didn't feel like compliance. It felt like observation, like he was waiting for something others hadn't yet seen coming. And somewhere deep in the system behind the counter, a quiet status update refreshed, unnoticed by everyone in the terminal except the man they had just asked to step aside. The moment Darius Coleman stepped aside from the main boarding lane, the energy at Gate B17 began to shift in ways that were subtle at first but impossible to ignore. What had been routine movement turned into fragmented pauses, small clusters of hesitation, and glances exchanged between passengers who were no longer sure what they were witnessing. Rebecca Mills remained at the counter, her attention locked on the system screen, but her confidence had started to fracture in small, visible ways, like a structure under pressure that had not yet collapsed. The boarding queue behind her slowed further when a second agent leaned in and quietly said that the reservation data was showing multiple verification flags that did not align with standard premium economy upgrades. Rebecca responded quickly, too quickly, insisting it was a routine mismatch that would be cleared in minutes, but her tone carried less certainty than before. Jason Miller, still holding his phone low but recording steadily, shifted closer to the scene, capturing not just Darius but the growing tension around him. A woman nearby whispered that she had never seen a boarding process stall like this without explanation, while another passenger checked the departure monitor as if the screen itself might provide answers. It was then that a man in his early 40s, wearing a tailored blazer and holding a priority boarding pass, stepped forward from the line. His name, according to his digital badge, was Kevin Blake, a frequent flyer with status privileges who clearly believed his presence carried authority in situations like this. He looked at Darius briefly, then turned to Rebecca and spoke with a tone that suggested impatience rather than inquiry. If there is an issue with capacity or verification, it should be handled faster. Some of us are paying for priority service, he said. The words landed in the space like an attempt to restore control, but instead they widened the tension. Rebecca nodded quickly, almost relieved to redirect attention, and responded that they were simply confirming a system inconsistency. Kevin glanced again at Darius, his eyes scanning the simple clothing, the calm posture, and the lack of visible status markers, and then added in a lower voice that sometimes people attempt to enter cabins they are not assigned to, intentionally or otherwise. The implication spread immediately among nearby passengers, subtle but sharp, and a few heads turned away while others leaned in closer. Darius remained still, his expression unchanged, his focus not on Kevin or Rebecca but on the small terminal monitor behind the counter where system messages continued to refresh in real time. Jason adjusted his phone angle slightly, capturing Kevin's words and Rebecca's reaction in the same frame, while the murmurs around them grew more layered, no longer confusion alone, but speculation forming into assumption. Rebecca attempted to regain procedural control by announcing that security protocol could be initiated if the discrepancy was not resolved within minutes. But even as she said it, her eyes briefly flicked toward her own screen, as if confirming something she did not want to fully acknowledge. A faint notification blinked in the corner of the system interface, indicating that the reservation in question was tied to internal corporate-level access, but it remained unread long enough for the human reaction to take precedence. Darius finally spoke again, not raising his voice, not addressing Kevin directly, but speaking into the space as if documenting reality in real time. "It is interesting how quickly certainty forms without full information," he said. The words did not escalate the situation, but they reframed it, and for a brief moment, even Kevin paused. Rebecca's hand hovered near the keyboard as the boarding flow behind her slowed further, passengers now fully aware that something beyond a simple ticket check was unfolding. And somewhere in the background system, another status update quietly shifted from pending to verified, unnoticed by those still arguing at the counter. The tension at Gate B17 had now settled into a different kind of silence, not empty but compressed, as if the entire boarding area was holding its breath without realizing it. Rebecca Mills stood behind the counter with her attention fixed on the terminal, but her earlier confidence had been replaced by a visible rigidity in her posture, the kind that appears when routine procedure begins to lose predictability. The system in front of her had updated again, but she had not fully processed what it meant, focusing instead on resolving what she still believed was a simple mismatch. Around her, the boarding flow had nearly stalled, passengers no longer advancing in a steady line, but instead forming uneven clusters, each person trying to interpret the situation through fragments of conversation and partial visibility. Kevin Blake remained near the front, his presence still projecting authority, though now slightly misaligned with the shifting atmosphere. He glanced between Rebecca and Darius Coleman, as if expecting reassurance that the system would correct itself and restore order. Jason Miller continued recording, his phone angled carefully to avoid detection, capturing not only the central interaction but the surrounding reactions, which were becoming just as significant as the dispute itself. A second passenger near the seating area leaned toward another and quietly said that delays like this usually only happened when someone was being removed or upgraded unexpectedly, a comment that spread quickly through nearby ears and added a new layer of speculation to the growing uncertainty. Rebecca finally clicked through to another screen, her fingers moving faster now, and paused when she saw a classification label she had not expected in a standard boarding review. The label indicated internal access alignment with corporate ownership tier authorization, but instead of stopping, she attempted to override it, assuming it was a system lag or duplication error. That small decision, made almost instinctively, shifted the entire trajectory of the moment without anyone fully realizing it yet. Darius remained where he stood, slightly apart from the main line, his posture unchanged, his attention calm and focused not on the reactions around him, but on the subtle pattern forming in the system behavior itself. Kevin stepped slightly closer to Rebecca's counter and asked again, this time more directly, whether the situation was going to affect boarding schedules for priority passengers, his tone carrying impatience that masked growing discomfort. Rebecca responded that they were handling a verification process, but her voice no longer carried the firmness it had earlier, instead sounding increasingly procedural, as if she was repeating language to maintain control rather than certainty. Jason adjusted his stance, capturing a clearer view of Rebecca's screen reflection, where small indicators of internal escalation were beginning to stack, though still not acknowledged aloud. A faint notification appeared again, this time more persistent, suggesting that the passenger record tied to the current boarding issue had triggered a higher-level audit flag. Rebecca hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than before, her eyes scanning the same line repeatedly, as if repetition could resolve ambiguity. Around them, passengers began to sense that something beyond a simple ticket verification was unfolding, though no official announcement had been made. Darius finally shifted his gaze toward the counter, not to demand attention, but to observe the progression of decisions being made about him without his input. His voice, when it came, remained steady and controlled, carrying no urgency, only clarity. At some point, he said, the system will speak louder than the assumptions being made in front of it. The words did not escalate the situation, but they altered the perception of it, introducing a weight that settled differently across those listening. Kevin frowned slightly, unsure how to interpret the statement, while Rebecca's hand hovered over the keyboard again, uncertain whether to proceed or pause. And in the background, the system interface finally refreshed one more time, this time aligning the passenger record with confirmed executive ownership status, a detail still unseen by those standing at the counter, but already beginning to change everything about what would happen next. The atmosphere at Gate B17 had shifted again, but this time the change was no longer subtle. It was structural, as if the environment itself had begun reacting to information that had not yet reached the people standing inside it. Rebecca Mills stared at the terminal screen longer than before, her fingers no longer moving with procedural confidence, but with hesitation that came from recognition of something she did not expect to see in a routine boarding workflow. The passenger record in front of her had fully updated, replacing standard verification tags with a corporate-level authorization profile that she had only seen in internal training modules but never in live operation. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she scrolled, attempting to reconcile what the system was showing with what she believed the situation to be. Around her, the boarding gate remained partially stalled, passengers no longer simply waiting but actively observing, sensing that the delay had evolved into something more complex than a simple administrative correction. Kevin Blake remained near the front, his earlier impatience now replaced with a quieter uncertainty as he noticed Rebecca's hesitation and the absence of immediate resolution. Jason Miller continued recording, now more openly, his phone no longer hidden at waist level, but raised enough to capture both the counter and the reactions forming in the line behind him. The energy among passengers had changed into something collective, a shared awareness that the situation no longer fit within normal boarding expectations. Rebecca finally clicked into the expanded passenger profile and paused completely when she saw the confirmation line indicating partial ownership authorization linked to airline governance structure. For a moment, she did not speak or move, her focus locked on the screen as if waiting for the system to correct itself automatically. But it did not. Instead, another update refreshed beneath it, confirming elevated access rights tied to corporate stakeholder status, accompanied by a system note indicating live audit engagement from headquarters. Rebecca slowly leaned back slightly, her expression tightening as procedural certainty gave way to realization. She turned her head briefly toward Darius Coleman, who still stood calmly a short distance from the main boarding lane, observing rather than participating in the unfolding reaction. Kevin, noticing the shift, finally asked in a lower tone whether there was an actual issue with the system that could delay boarding further, but Rebecca did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked back at the screen again, as if trying to verify whether what she was seeing required escalation beyond her authority. The silence at the counter grew heavier, and even nearby passengers began to sense that the process had moved beyond routine verification. Jason's recording captured Rebecca's hesitation clearly, along with the subtle shift in her posture that suggested uncertainty replacing control. A faint notification appeared again, this time accompanied by a system alert confirming that the passenger in question was now flagged under executive stakeholder review, meaning any manual restriction required corporate override approval. Rebecca's hand moved slightly toward the keyboard but stopped before making contact, her hesitation now visible to anyone watching closely. Darius finally stepped forward just enough to be closer to the counter, his voice still calm, but carrying a clarity that cut through the procedural tension without raising volume. "You are no longer looking at a boarding issue," he said. "You are looking at a system recognition delay." The words settled across the counter area, changing how those within earshot interpreted the unfolding silence. Kevin frowned, no longer confident in his earlier assumptions, while Rebecca remained focused on the screen, where the final line of verification had just shifted from pending to confirmed. And in that moment, without announcement or warning, the system fully aligned the passenger record with executive ownership authority, silently transforming the entire structure of the situation in front of them. The confirmation on the terminal screen did not arrive with noise or warning, but its impact was immediate, like a quiet structural shift that changed the meaning of everything that had happened before it. Rebecca Mills stared at the updated status line, her expression tightening as she processed the final verification that now clearly identified Darius Coleman as holding executive stakeholder authority within the airline governance structure. For a brief moment, she did not speak, did not move, as if waiting for a secondary system or supervisor override to contradict what she was seeing, but nothing changed. The screen remained steady, final, and unambiguous. Around her, the boarding gate that had once been filled with routine movement now felt suspended, as passengers gradually sensed that the delay was no longer procedural but foundational. Kevin Blake shifted his stance, no longer projecting impatience but uncertainty, his earlier assumptions collapsing into silence as he tried to interpret the shift in Rebecca's behavior. Jason Miller continued recording, now fully aware that whatever was happening had moved beyond a simple customer service dispute and into something far more significant, his phone capturing the counter, the screen reflection, and the subtle change in energy among staff and passengers alike. Rebecca finally exhaled slowly, her hand lowering slightly from the keyboard as she recognized that any attempt to override the system at her level was no longer applicable. The interface itself now displayed a corporate lock indicator, confirming that any restriction or escalation required direct executive authorization. She turned her head slightly toward Darius, her expression no longer confident, but carefully controlled, as if trying to recover procedural footing in a situation where procedure no longer applied in the way she understood it. Darius remained calm, his posture unchanged, standing just outside the boarding lane with the same measured stillness he had maintained from the beginning. Kevin finally spoke, his voice lower now, asking whether this meant boarding would continue or be paused, but Rebecca did not answer immediately, still focused on reconciling the implications of the system update with her earlier actions. The silence between them expanded, filled only by distant gate announcements and the subtle movement of passengers who were now fully aware that something irreversible had shifted at the counter. A new notification appeared on Rebecca's screen, this time indicating that the passenger record had triggered a live executive audit stream, meaning all interactions were now being monitored and logged in real time at corporate headquarters. Her eyes lingered on that line longer than anything else, and for the first time, she removed her hand completely from the console. Jason subtly adjusted his recording angle, capturing Rebecca's stillness and Kevin's uncertainty, as the surrounding passengers began to lean forward, sensing that resolution was no longer a question of verification but of response. Darius finally stepped closer to the counter, not in urgency, but in presence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined him from the start. At this point, he said, "You are not managing a passenger interaction. You are managing the consequences of a decision already recorded." The words settled heavily across the gate area, changing the posture of everyone who heard them. Rebecca looked back at the screen once more, then slowly withdrew her hand entirely, acknowledging without words that control of the situation had shifted beyond her role. And in the background system, the executive audit status finalized its activation, silently confirming that the entire gate process was now operating under corporate oversight. The executive audit confirmation had not brought silence to the gate, but rather a different kind of attention, one that carried weight without sound. At Gate B17, every movement now felt measured, as if the air itself had become aware that the situation was no longer operational but recorded. Rebecca Mills stood behind the counter with her hands no longer engaged with the terminal, her posture slightly rigid, eyes fixed forward while the system continued to display active corporate oversight status. She had stopped attempting corrections or verification because the interface no longer allowed discretionary input. Instead, it displayed a steady stream of audit indicators confirming that every prior action, including delays, verification attempts, and escalation notes, had already been logged in real time. Kevin Blake, who had earlier positioned himself as a confident priority passenger, now stood slightly back from the counter line, his gaze shifting between Rebecca and Darius Coleman with a subtle uncertainty that he could not fully mask. Jason Miller continued recording without interruption, his device capturing not only the central interaction but also the reactions forming around it, including passengers who were now openly observing rather than casually waiting. The boarding queue itself had stopped functioning as a queue, transforming into a semicircle of attention focused on the counter where authority had shifted without announcement. Rebecca finally spoke into her internal headset, her voice lower than before, requesting clarification from operations control, but the response she received was brief and procedural, confirming that all actions were now under executive audit supervision and could not be independently altered at the gate level. That confirmation removed any remaining ambiguity. She slowly lowered the headset, acknowledging without verbal admission that her control over the situation had ended. Darius remained in the same position, calm and composed, his presence unchanged by the shift in authority dynamics around him. When he finally moved closer to the counter again, it was not abrupt, but deliberate, as if closing the distance only to ensure clarity rather than confrontation. His voice remained steady, carrying the same controlled tone that had defined his presence from the beginning. "This was never about access," he said. "It was about assumption." The words did not escalate the situation, but they reframed it entirely. Kevin shifted his weight slightly, no longer attempting to assert influence, while Rebecca looked briefly toward him before returning her focus to the system screen, where the audit feed now displayed continuous logging of every interaction since the initial boarding scan. A new message appeared, indicating that corporate compliance had been notified and was reviewing real-time gate activity, including staff decision points and passenger interaction history. Jason's recording now captured a different atmosphere entirely, one where authority was no longer being enforced but evaluated. Passengers near the front of the gate began speaking in lower tones, some expressing confusion, others recognition that what they had witnessed earlier was no longer a simple misunderstanding, but part of a larger procedural breakdown now under review. Rebecca finally stepped slightly away from the counter, her hands no longer touching any controls, signaling the complete transfer of operational authority away from the gate. And in that moment, the system interface refreshed once more, confirming that executive oversight had transitioned from passive monitoring to active governance, meaning every further decision would be executed from corporate control rather than local authority. The transition to full executive oversight did not create noise or disruption at Gate B17, but instead introduced a controlled stillness that felt heavier than the earlier confusion. The boarding area, once filled with fragmented movement and uncertain procedure, now operated under a different psychological condition, where every action was implicitly understood to be recorded and reviewed in real time. Rebecca Mills stood away from the counter entirely now, her hands no longer engaged with any system interface, her posture reflecting a quiet acceptance of procedural authority that had moved beyond her control. The terminal screen continued to display executive audit active status, along with continuous logging indicators that confirmed every prior decision had been captured without omission. Kevin Blake remained near the front of the boarding zone, no longer attempting to assert priority or influence, his earlier confidence replaced by a measured silence as he observed the unfolding situation without intervention. Jason Miller continued recording steadily, his device now capturing a broader field of view that included staff, passengers, and the gate display itself, which had become the focal point of attention. Around them, passengers had stopped treating the delay as an inconvenience and were now fully engaged as observers of a procedural event they did not fully understand but instinctively recognized as significant. A subtle change occurred when a system message appeared on the main gate display, not directed at staff or passengers, but as a corporate-level directive acknowledging live executive intervention in gate operations. The message did not provide explanation, only confirmation that all actions taken from the moment of escalation were under centralized review. Rebecca read it once, then did not read it again, as if further acknowledgement would not change what had already been established. Darius Coleman remained composed in the same position he had maintained since the beginning, his presence unchanged by the escalation around him. When he finally spoke, it was not to demand or instruct, but to clarify the nature of what had already occurred. Systems do not correct perception, he said. They only record it. The words were calm, but they carried weight across the gate area, settling into the awareness of those who had been following the interaction from the beginning. Kevin shifted slightly, no longer attempting to interpret authority through visible cues, but instead listening without response. Rebecca kept her gaze forward, not on any individual, but on the terminal status indicators that now showed continuous synchronization with corporate oversight channels. Jason adjusted his recording again, capturing the moment where silence itself became part of the documentation. A second system alert appeared, confirming that executive governance had escalated from passive monitoring to active procedural authority, meaning that any further gate-level actions would require direct corporate validation before execution. The implication of this update was not announced aloud, but it was understood by those closest to the counter. The boarding process remained paused, but not suspended, existing in a state of observation rather than operation. Darius took a small step closer to the counter, not to assert dominance, but to conclude clarity within the environment. What you are witnessing, he said, is not disruption. It is correction. The statement did not provoke reaction, but it did finalize understanding for those who had been uncertain. Rebecca finally stepped fully away from the counter line, no longer engaged in any procedural role, her attention now aligned with the realization that the situation had moved beyond local resolution. And in the background, the system maintained its executive audit state, confirming that every decision, hesitation, and interaction from the beginning of the incident was now permanently recorded under corporate authority, with no further manual override available at the gate level. At Gate B17, the atmosphere had fully transitioned from procedural uncertainty into structured accountability, where every remaining action was now perceived as part of a recorded corporate review rather than a local operational decision. Rebecca Mills stood slightly apart from the counter area, no longer interacting with the terminal, her earlier attempts at verification and escalation replaced by a quiet stillness that reflected full procedural disengagement. The system screens continued to display executive audit active status, but a new layer of messaging had now appeared across the interface indicating compliance review in progress, meaning that all prior gate decisions were being evaluated against corporate governance standards in real time. Kevin Blake remained near the boarding line, his posture noticeably less assertive than before, as he observed the unfolding situation without attempting to influence it further, his earlier assumptions about priority access and procedural authority no longer providing any functional advantage in the environment he was standing in. Jason Miller continued recording without interruption, his device capturing both the central counter and the surrounding passengers, who had now shifted from passive observers into fully attentive witnesses of a process that was no longer operational but evaluative. A new system notification appeared across the gate display confirming that boarding operations were temporarily placed under corporate directive hold, meaning no further passenger movement could proceed until executive review concluded the active audit cycle. The message was brief, impersonal, and final in tone, reinforcing the understanding that authority had completely shifted away from the gate level. Rebecca read the message once, then lowered her gaze, no longer engaging with the interface, as if acknowledging that her role in the process had reached its limit. Darius Coleman remained in the same position he had maintained throughout the escalation, calm and observant, his presence unchanged by the structural reversal taking place around him. When he spoke, his voice carried the same controlled clarity that had defined him from the beginning, and he did not raise it or direct it toward any individual, but instead toward the situation itself. Accountability does not interrupt systems, he said. It activates them. The statement settled across the gate area, reframing everything that had occurred from the initial boarding interaction to the current audit state as part of a continuous procedural chain rather than isolated events. Kevin shifted slightly, no longer attempting to assert status or interpretation. While Rebecca remained still, her attention no longer on the counter, but on the realization that every decision she had made since the initial interaction was now part of a permanent corporate record under executive review. Jason subtly adjusted his recording angle again, capturing the silence that followed, which had become more significant than any earlier verbal exchange. A second corporate update appeared on the system interface, confirming that gate-level authority had been suspended pending final audit resolution and that all staff actions were now subject to centralized compliance evaluation. This confirmation did not produce reaction from staff, but it altered the behavior of nearby passengers, who now stood more openly as observers of a formalized accountability process rather than a delayed boarding sequence. Rebecca finally stepped fully away from the counter zone, aligning herself physically with the recognition that operational control had been removed from her entirely. Kevin remained in place, but no longer engaged with any staff member, his attention fixed on the broader implication of the system state rather than the earlier conflict. Darius took one final measured step closer to the counter, not to assert influence, but to bring closure to the moment of understanding, and when he spoke again, his tone remained steady and composed. "What you are seeing now," he said, "is the system reflecting every assumption it was built to ignore." The words did not provoke response, but they finalized comprehension across those present. And in the background, the executive audit interface confirmed full synchronization with corporate governance records, locking all prior gate activity into permanent review status, ensuring that no action taken at the local level could be altered, erased, or reinterpreted outside of executive oversight. The final state of Gate B17 was no longer one of uncertainty or escalation, but of complete procedural closure under executive authority review, where every action, decision, and interaction had already been logged, indexed, and sealed within the corporate audit system. The boarding area, once defined by movement and routine travel behavior, now felt static, as if time itself had slowed in acknowledgement of the finality of the system status. Rebecca Mills stood fully away from the operational counter, no longer in any active role, her attention no longer directed at the terminal screens, which continued to display locked audit confirmation and executive governance control. The realization that her authority had been fully superseded was no longer theoretical, but visibly reflected in the system interface, which now showed read-only compliance mode, preventing any further local input or override. Kevin Blake remained within the boarding zone, but no longer positioned himself as an influencer of the process. His earlier assumptions about priority status and procedural leverage completely neutralized by the corporate-level escalation that had redefined the entire environment. Jason Miller continued recording, but his movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if recognizing that the moment he was capturing had transitioned from conflict into resolution through documentation rather than intervention. Passengers who had earlier been passive observers were now fully engaged witnesses, their attention fixed not on movement or delay, but on the conclusion of a system-level correction that had unfolded in real time before them. A final system message appeared across the gate display confirming that Executive Audit Review had concluded initial assessment and confirmed full alignment of passenger records with corporate governance verification standards. The message carried no emotional tone, only procedural finality, indicating that all prior discrepancies, assumptions, and gate-level decisions had been resolved within the executive framework. Rebecca read the message once and then did not react further, her posture remaining still, as if accepting that her role had been fully absorbed into the larger system process. Darius Coleman stood calmly in the same position he had maintained throughout the entire sequence, his presence unchanged by the procedural transformation that had taken place around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, not elevated, and carried the same controlled clarity that had defined every moment of his involvement. This was never about correction, he said. It was about visibility. The words settled across the gate area, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion, reframing the entire sequence of events as an exposure of assumptions that had operated without awareness of their own limitations. Kevin remained silent, no longer attempting interpretation or assertion, while Rebecca continued to face forward, her focus no longer on systems or screens, but on the irreversible nature of recorded accountability. Jason lowered his device slightly, indicating that what had been captured was no longer unfolding in real time, as the final corporate audit status confirmed full case closure with executive endorsement. And in that moment, Gate B17 returned to operational readiness not through reversal of events, but through completion of oversight, leaving behind a permanently recorded sequence of decisions that could no longer be altered, only reviewed within the corporate system that had governed it from the moment of activation.